So I was just saying to Caroline, I'm kind of starting where in that place that she describes with that paper on Flickr and photo sharing, actually, to just try to give you a sense of where I've come from. So in the first section, the overview section, I want to kind of establish my take on these issues. And I guess creative citizenship is a term that I've adopted for the purpose of this presentation. As Caroline said, I've been working with the idea of cultural citizenship in relation to everyday creativity. So I'm going to sketch out some of that conceptual framework for you before kind of taking you on a bit of a journey back to the future of everything at the very optimistic moment of Web 2.0 and all of the rhetoric and discourse around participatory culture, before giving you a sense of, I guess, how I'm thinking about how digital media in the social media moment is remediating everyday creativity and creative citizenship in new ways. Some of the possible competing futures or discourses about the competing futures in that space, and then a few provocations about what digital creative citizenship might look like. So I guess right from the beginning of my academic career and up to now, I've been investigating the way that digital media is changing the face of cultural participation and public communication at the same time. A decade ago when I started, in that early heyday of the Web 2.0 and participatory culture moment, we looked to blogs, to image sharing, to community-based digital storytelling workshops as ways that everyday creativity might find its audiences and that ordinary people might find each other in ways that had not been possible on such a widespread and visible scale before. And so the bottom two images there, below by the way, I forgot to mention, below the St Kilda Community Garden image, which you can find on Wikimedia, is a screenshot from Flickr from around this time, around 2005, 2006, and a photo from a digital storytelling workshop that worked with older people on place-based oral history and digital storytelling. But in doing all of this practical and empirical research, my theoretical orientation lies predominantly in cultural studies, the Australian version imported from Britain via John Hartley, among other people. And so my definitions of cultural citizenship emphasise personal, everyday and even mundane practices of creativity like storytelling, photo sharing, scrapbooking, graffiti, skateboarding, cooking or gardening. Practices I collectively called vernacular creativity, and I theorised the way that these might serve to connect individuals and communities in the service of broader civic goals, and how digital media might be changing, amplifying or troubling those relationships. So with that theoretical framework in mind, I want to offer you my take on the relationship between creative citizenship and digital media. I've got three sort of models, I suppose. The first one, creative ways of being a citizen, which is, I think, much of what we've been talking about in this conference so far. So there I'm thinking about creative and collaborative approaches to solving civic challenges using digital and social media. That is, creative ways of being citizenly, if you like. Using digital media to organise, to promote, to coordinate. So if we think about the example of the community garden, there we might be thinking about using digital media to coordinate, to map, as we heard from Farida Viz's paper yesterday, community gardens and allotments and so on. The second one there is probably more squarely in the space that I've been working, and that is thinking about creativity, creative practices that through their enactment, visibility and connectedness in digital media enable certain modes of civic engagement as an often unintended consequence of participation in those activities. So, for example, you can imagine, and I have observed people getting involved in local or international associations, organisations built around their personal everyday interest in gardening or in food or whatever it might be, via finding each other online as their creative productions on those topics find audiences. And thirdly, something I've been thinking about more recently, and that I think a lot of the politics around net neutrality, around some of our social media platforms are really bringing to the fore the idea of citizenship understood as the rights and responsibilities toward creative communities of which one is a member, and of engaging in the politics of platforms that support that creative activity. So thinking about being a citizen of digital media, if you like. So jumping back to the Web 2.0 moment. And you can see there, I mean, these infographics about how digital media is exploding have been around for a long time, but the scale of the explosions keeps changing. So this is from 2003, showing about a year and a half's worth of growth in the number of blogs that Technorati, which was a leading blog sort of tracker, was tracking, and going from basically a couple of thousand to 4 million in that time. This was an astonishing graphic that was passed around, that that was reported in Wired. 4 million seemed like a stupendous number of people from the world's population to be participating in blogging at the time. So this particular moment around 2004, which is when I happened to start my PhD on this topic, was a key period of optimism for creative citizenship and digital media understood in the ways that I've just outlined. The Web 2.0 moment saw the rise of automated blogging software like Blogger and Movable Type, the widespread take-up of these tools, and the broader idea of Web 2.0 services focused on providing platforms for user-created content and connectivity. The barriers to participation in digital culture were now much lower, but participation was still very far from population-wide. This was a moment of astonishing artisanal DIY creative citizenship, but still it was really the domain of the digerati, not the masses. It was the domain of people who were interested in the internet already. But there was still a strong sense that the rules and roles of culture were changing. The academic field of research around participatory culture was marked by debates for and against the cultural and social value of user-created content. On the one hand, you had Time declaring the Person of the Year as You in 2006 or 7. And on the other hand, you had Andrew Keane and other populist polemicists raising deep concerns that Wikipedia and YouTube and blogging were going to actually destroy the fabric of cultural expertise, destroy the aesthetic regimes of modernity, and all kinds of things. But what both the optimists and pessimists agreed on is that there was a change occurring in who had access to cultural production and cultural curation and cultural evaluation. There were some early concerns as well about free labour in these contexts, but the massive market in user data, behavioural targeted marketing, the algorithmic turn, all of those things that are such hot issues in digital culture today were all yet to come. Or at least they hardly registered for most of these critics. So if we fast forward to 10 years later, to round about, well, not to 10 years later, actually about 6 years later, to the end of that first decade of the 21st century, I think we arrived at a very different kind of moment, structured by a different set of relationships between the tech industry, the users, and culture. And this is one that I've been calling the platform paradigm, which is a key element of this social media moment, characterised by the dominance of a very few mainstream platforms that bring together user-created content, interpersonal communication, and public communication within the structure of a social networking site. So there's a lot of convergence within the platforms and a lot of convergence to a small number of platforms, and that is true globally. Although the icons that you line up may be different in China, it is still true that there is a small number of video sharing sites, microblogging sites, and so on. So indeed, if we return to my third model, the idea of being a creative citizen of digital media, we might even think of platforms in some ways as analogous to city-states. In fact, Mark Zuckerberg was infamously called the Sultan of Facebookistan in the media at one stage. It's funny because it's true, but perhaps that's stretching civic metaphors a bit far. I don't know what you think. Maybe not. But certainly, we can think about platforms as the institutions of the new media environment. Not quite analogous maybe to the BBC, but something else. But certainly they serve the function of institutions in economic terms. That is, they coordinate activity, they regulate. So they both enable and constrain that activity. And what's interesting and new for me as a scholar and forcing me to learn new skills and new techniques of research is that the means of this coordination and regulation is done socio-technically. So with software, with code, with interfaces, with APIs, and not only with sort of brute force access and discourse. So a crucial element of the work that I've been doing on platform studies, if you like, over the last little while, has been trying to understand the digital elements of social media platforms as material elements and understanding platforms as being co-created at the same time. So I don't want to reproduce the technological determinist versus cultural determinist position, but I need to understand how user practices, behaviours and norms, how wider representations of platforms play as much of a role as programming decisions made within the engineering department of Twitter Incorporated, and how those things work together. Because it's through the interactions between all these bits of stuff that platforms are constituted, that they do things, and all of these elements are co-influential in what each platform actually is and means to people and can be used for. So I don't think it's hyperbolic at all to say that a very great deal of social life at both the micro and macro level has become entangled with digital media, whether we're reluctantly entangled or willingly entangled. Our government services, the businesses, our insurance companies, our families entangle us all the time. Mark Deuser talks about this as media life in a book released, I think, last year or the year before. So the social media moment is one of a new kind of ubiquity, legitimisation and normalisation of social media. Even in contexts where the penetration of digital devices is still growing, these dominant platforms will be inextricably part of the digital media ecology. Think about Facebook's attempts to get the Facebook phone in the hands of every new digital media user in Africa. So it's a phone where the internet is provided by Facebook, therefore the internet is Facebook. And as many of you know, I'm sure, even for people in our cultural contexts, the internet often is Facebook for a lot of people. You know, and Android, of course, comes pre-wrapped with all of Google's services embedded in it, Facebook pre-installed and so on. And the global shift to mobile media greatly extends the meaning of ubiquity into our workplaces, our homes, our schools, and now our pockets, and with the rise of wearables, our bodies. But with the new ubiquity comes the new legitimacy. So social media, since this moment, which was quite a hyperbolic statement about the role of social media, I think since then, social media has almost receded into the background. It's become a core part of the communications infrastructure of our societies. And quite visibly legitimated along the way by government and community uses for practical purposes in undeniably serious, momentous situations, like the Queensland floods that occurred in my hometown of Brisbane in December and January 2011, affecting much of the rest of rural Queensland as well. And famously, in this situation, the Queensland Police Service were very visibly on the front foot in effectively using social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook to coordinate the government and community response in a move that surprised everybody. Because I don't know, if you know anything about Australian politics, the Queensland Police aren't exactly known for being groovy friends to the young people, stuff like that. But it just takes one innovative, creative police media liaison person to sit in the Situation Room with their iPad and say, let's just get all this stuff out before the press conference, to really change things. It really changed the media mix. But anyway, the key point here is that uses like that legitimate social media. So it's not just pointless teenage activity anymore. And actually, academic research has aided this legitimation process by doing large-scale data-driven research only made possible by access to the Twitter API, or Application Programming Interface, which is really intended for commercial third-party development. And access to such data is highly controversial and politicised in itself. And our team back at QUT has done a whole lot of this kind of research. We have an ongoing project on crisis communication in collaboration with government organisations. So our research is often rolled out in the media around every natural disaster as a kind of legitimation of social media as a channel. And the mainstreaming of social media platforms like Twitter has also made possible a whole range of communities of interest and practice to emerge. So one that I've been studying recently is called AgChat Oz, based on the worldwide AgChat movement, which sets up weekly online chats for farmers and agribusiness practitioners and so on, and rural people in general. It has weekly Twitter Q&A sessions which use the AgChatOz hashtag to capture discussions of interest to this self-identifying agricultural community, ranging from personal issues such as succession planning for the farm, who's going to take over the farm when all the kids are leaving town, rural mental health, which is a major issue in Australia as it is elsewhere, to work matters like sustainable farming methods, how to manage natural disasters, as well as more sort of cross-societal concerns like animal welfare, and food security. So most of these discussions solicit a range of perspectives from producers, consumers, scientists, journalists and other professionals. And this is a map of followers and followees among all of the accounts that participate on the AgChatOz hashtag. They're coloured according to an algorithm that identifies groupings that are more group-like than they should be if everything was random. And what you see there is the way that on the bottom left-hand side there, the leftish Twitter Terriat. This is a very active group of Twitter users who are quite famous in Australia and shuttle between a range of topics, connecting in various ways to a very closely interconnected group of farmers who see themselves as a more close-knit community. And so one of the things I've been observing is how these topics and conversations travel across these networks, enabled by this hashtag, which originally was, of course, a user-led innovation in the Twitter platform. And sometimes these discussions connect to quite controversial issues and their hashtags, like the hashtag ban live export for the issue of animal welfare in the meat industry, causing a collision of constituencies. But on the lighter side, providing a platform for what I would see as a great example of creative citizenship, where farmers are harnessing the power and attention around the selfie phenomenon, if you like, to invent a new hashtag, Felfie, which is farmers' selfies, often posing with their animals. Or just like being on the farm and getting a lot of attention, actually. There was a story in The Guardian before I even paid attention to it. I mean, I used to know things before The Guardian did about the internet, but this is the new ubiquity, right? And some of you know what's coming, I think. Of course, social media has its own cultures, its own kind of models of participation that support practices of what John Hartley has called silly citizenship. And here I would include all kinds of memes, the viral culture of the web, which of course can be used for good and evil, and recently theorised and described in a really wonderful way by Lemore Schiffman, who has a book out on memes. And actually they're a vital part of political discourse today, both in terms of big P and small p politics, so things like gender, for example. So of course, This is a really ill-advised bit of PR on behalf of David Cameron, who's on the phone to the President of the United States, talking about very serious issues. It says there, if you can't read it, I've been speaking to Barack Obama about the situation in Ukraine. We are united in condemnation of Russia's actions. So whereupon Rob Delaney, who's just a famous Twitter comedian, which is kind of a thing you can be now, who says, "Hi guys, I'm on the line now too, get me up to speed." Patrick Stewart follows on with, "I'm now patched in as well, sorry for the delay." There's actually, you can Google this, someone's put together all of these. There's another 100 equally funny ones. On the bottom left there, you've got David Cameron patched into the party phone call from Mean Girls. So, does everyone know this film? Some of you probably don't, but they're having a really bitchy party line conversation about how things aren't fetch, which is a word they've made up for things that are cool or not cool. And the tweet says, "This Ukraine situation is so not fetch." And then, of course, you've got Batman responding to the call on the bat phone. So, yes, silly citizenship, definitely. It's all very funny, but it's not just taking the piss out of David Cameron. It's a critique of the mediation of contemporary politics, and a serious one as well. Okay, so jokes aside. But simultaneously with all this flourishing of activity, the new ubiquity, the new legitimacy, the affordances of these dominant platforms have changed in complex ways that, at least according to critics like Jose van Dijk, do support mass take-up in the service of business interests, but they do not necessarily support mass democratisation. They may not actually support user creativity and innovation in the way that they once did. So this is a really wonderful book, actually, and there's a chapter on Twitter that talks about the reduction of interpretative flexibility. So from an early kind of experimental, hey, we'll just build this thing, see what people want to do with it, phase to, oh, we'll take that you invented, and we'll take that you invented, and then we'll lock the door, and we've got a stable platform that we can go back to our venture capitalists with, and a business model. So kind of locking out people who contributed to the value of the platform. That's the argument. It's worth reading this book. I always like to compare, when I hear this argument, though, I always like to just keep in mind another moment of enclosure, which is the original Kodak box camera in about 1898. This was actually a vehicle for a failed innovation, which was the roll film system that Eastman had invented, and that professional and artistic photographers absolutely refused to have anything to do with, because it was taking a lot of the craft, science and expertise of the whole kind of value chain of producing a photograph out of their hands and handing it over to a company that wanted to monetize just the development of film. So Eastman kind of had to invent a new market for this new fangled practice of photography. And so that's what this camera was designed to do, was to create a mass market in amateur photography. And the slogan famously is, for the Kodak camera, was, "You press the button, we do the rest." So anathema to most models of citizenship and creativity, right? The maker movement says, if you can't open it, you don't own it. Hackability is so important to our ideas about agency in relation to technology. And of course, a market had to be created. People had to be taught and convinced that photography was a thing that they should be doing, that was part of family life, that was part of leisure, that women could do. So if you think about iPad marketing, quite similar, something that your mum can use. But I think the critique then hits a bit of a cul-de-sac, because if you think about the amazing richness and creativity that the hand camera actually afforded, that domestic amateur photography actually afforded, you kind of get a bit stuck with that hardline critique. So I think we have to keep these things in tension. That's always been my position. Of course, Instagram's brand identity almost could be borrowed directly from the Kodak, right? And we know the critiques of the filters in Instagram and how, if you're photography aficionados, you'll know those critiques. Okay, but I do think there have been some significant shifts in the way that users and their agency have been repositioned as these platforms have grown and mature, and we've had this platform paradigm emerge in the social media moment. Especially as these platforms have grown beyond all expectation while the venture capital was running out and they're trying to go public, so they need to make money. So I've been doing a bit of work on the history of Twitter as a platform recently, so I'll just take you through the story so far. So Twitter originally, because it was Web 2.0, you had to not have the E at the end of it, and you had to have these round bubbly logos. So Twitter is a new mobile service that helps groups of friends bounce random thoughts around with SMS. When we showed it to Jason Goldman, product manager of Blogger, he called it, oh, it's present tense blogging. So we see they're understanding Twitter in terms of very kind of mundane, interpersonal communication. There was no sense that it was going to be, well, what it is today. This was the original homepage, which says, the timeline is for following along with what your friends are doing throughout the day. So this micro-social kind of idea of participation. What up? Send updates from your cell or from the web. What? They can't stop you. It's all very kind of, hipsterish. And then you can list your contacts as peeps, star the friends you really like, and get their update on your cell. So this is obviously a very scaled down version, and in fact, very quickly they had to get rid of the getting live updates on your cell thing because too many people were joining and it was becoming a whole other thing. This is a couple of the first tweets from the original 4 or 5 guys who were in the company. This thing sucks, I don't even know what it's for. And Jack Dorsey, the co-founder, this is what Twitter was for back then. Fast forward just a couple of years, famously Twitter was promoted at South by Southwest in 2007 and became very popular amongst the geek IT crowd. And a much more slick web interface asked us, what are you doing? But that was the question that you responded to. And if you go back through users' entire histories of tweets, which I've done, you can see people directly answer this question, like going to work, coming home from work, babysitting, whatever it might be. As Twitter started to scale up, as the new legitimacy and ubiquity started to creep in, and journalists started to use it, and politicians started to use it, and people were following other users and not necessarily updating a lot themselves, the discourse shifted from a kind of me-centred universe to a me in the world-centred universe. So what's happening replaces what are you doing. Around the same time, there's some real public argy-bargy about what Twitter and what social media is actually for, particularly as social media marketing takes off as a career and a business, and the social media marketers get really involved in telling us what Twitter was supposed to be for. The idea that you would share information or experiences or feelings about your everyday life, about your family, about your lunch, started to become demonised, and so you saw stuff like this, which had got a lot of people quite exercised, about 40% of Twitter being pointless babble. And as Twitter starts to try to raise more and more money, the idea that if you can get more celebrities involved, you can get more media businesses involved in tweeting, then you can create audience for brands. So users are starting to be repositioned not so much as expressive individual citizens, but as audience. And those two things, of course, aren't incompatible, but this is a significant shift. So very much Twitter's now very much positioning itself as a media channel, doing all kinds of deals with other big media companies and so on. Another thing that I've done to illustrate this is I've grabbed every single blog post on the official Twitter blog since 2006 and just run the blog posts through Leximancer, which finds concepts and themes and their relationships in corpora of texts. And what I'm looking at here is the main themes that Leximancer found in each year. And of course, Twitter is the dominant theme all the time because it's the Twitter blog and it's about Twitter. But on the bottom line there in each one, you see the key concepts that are associated with Twitter as a theme. And it's really interesting to see how these shift. Okay, so the first year, Twitter, phone, friends, web, mobile, update, site, SMS, use, texting. So it's like we're building this thing and people are going to use it and this is the technology of it. 2 years later, 2008, Twitter, work use, SMS team, number world users take. This is where they're building as a startup. They're taking the company to the next level of being a serious business. 2010, Twitter, people, users, use, experience, service, using. This is where they're making a lot of major updates and enhancements to the user interface and the user experience. But then 2012, Twitter, follow, conversation, people, world, share, closer, page, experience, day. So this is where this shift happens in kind of thinking about how Twitter could connect global citizens, how Twitter would connect you and your everyday experience with what's going on out there in the world. But then fast forward to now, 2014, and you would think that Twitter was about nothing but being a fan of the World Cup because it just says Twitter, fans, conversation, players, action, team throughout TV. So they're doing a major push to kind of get social TV happening as the magical answer to the revenue streams. So that's just an illustration of the shifts. One of the shifts that I think is occurring that I use the shorthand, the self and the world to understand. And as these platforms evolve and the technical means to advertise and market to us become ever more sophisticated, our experiences of them are ever more heavily mediated by the corporate interests of these platforms. Even when the corporate interest is to serve us content that is relevant to us and that we like, keeping us coming back for more. So some of you probably already read this book. It's a pretty big bestseller, The Filter Bubble, which explains how personalisation and social relevance of the results, search engine results, for example, or Amazon search results, result in you not being exposed to the viewpoints and tastes of people who are not like you. So, for example, if you're in the Bible Belt of the US and you search for gay marriage, for example, you'll get a very different set of results than if you're in San Francisco and you search for gay marriage. So it's based on location. It's based on if you're logged into Google Plus when you search Google. It's based on what your friends on Google Plus like. This kind of stuff. And some of you might have seen some stuff going around in Facebook about people doing experiments about not liking anything for a month. And that's in response to what we now know about the Facebook newsfeed algorithm and how that all works. Well, we know a little bit about how it works. This graphic's been floating around for a while. Some of you have probably seen it before. And I think for a lot of users, the idea that their newsfeed isn't a representation of what their friends have posted on Facebook has been a bit of a revelation. And that actually it's really heavily curated in order to keep you very happy and coming back to Facebook a lot. So those real downer stories about like what's happening in the Middle East don't tend to come up to the top of your newsfeed, for example. And Gilad Lotan has done work across a lot of the data from a lot of different social media platforms. So I'd really encourage you to just Google Gilad, G-I-L-A-D, Lotan, and Gaza and social media, and you'll find this story published across a number of outlets. This particular visualization is showing the co-occurrence of Instagram tags concerned with what's going on in Gaza. So showing, maybe predictably, but kind of depressingly, a massive polarization of viewpoints. And this is not what social media was supposed to promise us. It's supposed to promise that we could encounter difference and accommodate difference. And we now know that that if your friends were mostly pro-Israel, you would see a lot of pro-Israel stuff in your Facebook news feed. If you might have had a few friends who had a more balanced view, or might have dug up that really in-depth, long-form piece from the New York Times, but doesn't fit the algorithm quite so well, so you might not have even seen it. So where does that all leave the creative citizen or community-led initiatives that aim to support creative citizenship that are entangled with or reliant on or interested in using digital media? So here, I think, again, we can take some lessons from the creative communities that already populate the digital media environment and think about some of the strategies and tactics of the digital creative citizen. So I'm thinking here about the indie games scene, I'm thinking about the YouTube community, I'm thinking about the tricksters of Weird Twitter, which is a kind of indie avant-garde community on the Twitter platform, and ordinary Facebook users trying to game the algorithm. So I'm thinking about exploits, exploiting the social media logics, taking advantage of them, knowing how to drive stuff up to the top of the algorithms and kind of messing with them, and embracing playfulness and silliness, which is a really very powerful dynamic, cultural dynamic of the internet. I don't want to sound like I'm giving you advice. You'll know this, that it's important not to delegate everything to one or two of these platforms, to maintain your own web presence, to playfully jump around between them. And to think about creative, playful, and critical engagement with these platforms as part of digital media literacy, alongside creative production. So thinking about the digital storytelling movement, for example, building into that, thinking about where your content might be published, how you'd like to manage audiences and publics for it, so on and so forth. I think I have come to the end. I just leave you with a funny dog picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean, for a very, very interesting talk, and actually also a kind of expansion more on social media and the role of social media. Any question as a starter for Jean? Ian, please.
Hello.
Hi, Jean. That was just fantastic. A really, really remarkable and insightful go through it. But I want to ask you a question you didn't deal with, which is, it's kind of hot in my mind because I woke up yesterday to read stories in the newspapers that News Corporation had launched a big sort of Brussels-based attack on Google, trying to get Google back in front of the competition authorities. Okay. A long-running story. And the guy whose name's on the story is Robert Thompson, who used to be a colleague of mine, a journalist at the FT. And Robert is now chief executive of some pod or other of News Corp. He's an Australian Murdoch guy.
Sorry.
But a very nice man, and a very highly. Yeah, but he's picked up the stuff that is reflected in the analysis that you're giving. My question is, what are your thoughts on the politics of this? I mean, I mentioned yesterday the Tim Berners-Lee campaign, the Web We Want, the Magna Carta for the Internet. There is a huge thing going on in Europe right now where Europe is trying to make up its mind where it wants to be on the nature of the internet, to the extent that Europe's view on that kind of makes any difference. These corporate pressures are enormous. Tell us something of what you think about the politics of all of that.
So you mean the geopolitics, the internet regulation and policy Is that what you mean by
Well,
politics?
suppose that we are all coming from a point of view that in different ways says, we'd like digital creativity to thrive. What News Corp is now arguing is that for digital creativity to thrive, you have to break up Google, for example.
Right.
Yeah, so
Okay.
it's kind of one big corporation versus another. So if your preoccupation is digital citizenship or creativity, it gets quite confusing about where you pitch your tent.
It's not just one corporation against another, it's one corporation against another within a complex international legal framework as well. So I don't sit in anywhere in particular other than to say that I think sometimes trying to operate in different national contexts forces platforms to be less overbearing and controlling and more competitive, and in other contexts less. So an example of that is YouTube. When YouTube decided to localize for different markets, it's really in order to do the licensing deals with the copyright agencies in all of those different markets. So the discourse around it was, we're going to give you more relevant stuff to your country. You don't care about, Spanish football teams. You want to know about Australian rock bands. But really what it was doing, as you all know, is creating a situation where every 11th video you try to watch says this video is not available in your country, and also serving you results that are really parochial. So, I mean, that's a bad example. On the other hand, Twitter has been quite transparent and quite resistant to governments' attempts to surveil citizens to acquire, for the CIA or whoever it might be, to acquire user data. Twitter's been quite resistant to national governments' attempts to censor content as well. On the question of competition and monopoly and all that stuff between the big media players and the internet platforms, I don't know as much, actually, but maybe some others would have some comment. It's a good point, but I haven't thought about it.
Right. Other questions? The lady behind John, yes.
Hello, thank you for a really interesting presentation. I wanted to ask about I really like this last slide, and it's a nice way to finish. And I wanted to ask you about the strategies, and also because I came recently across this headline from one of the blogs, which was saying transmedia is a word for old people, which suggests that already, I suppose, there is a generation of people who kind of acts in that way and lives across different media and has the way of managing that self, let's say, that exists across those different media. And I was wondering if you came across any examples of that in your research, perhaps, of those strategies.
Well, young people have incredible tactics. Now that we have the new ubiquity and the legitimacy, and everybody's parents are on Twitter and Facebook, I think that the use of ephemeral media like Snapchat, the use of pseudonyms, multiple pseudonyms, and kind of, I don't know, the dark social web, I think is really interesting, a really interesting one. There's all kinds of things going on there, but probably some of my colleagues who work more with youth and digital media would know more specific, but that's what immediately occurs to me in response to your question.
John?
Thanks, Jean. Great survey of what's going on at the moment. For the last year, I've been sort of really stuck with this feeling that the internet's over, and it's post Snowden and it's post the platform enclosures that you talked about. But I'm still attached to the nostalgia from my Web 2.0 moment of enthusiasm and optimism. I can't quite let go of it, like you, I think, probably.
Not at all. I'm very cynical.
You always start off from a place that appeals to my optimism and then takes me somewhere else. Okay, so I guess my question is, first of all, this prescription here, it's not exactly an everyday people set of actions. That's what concerns me about it. It's a sort of, if I was an 18-year-old with a lot of time on my hands, and I wanted to spend my time in the dark web, I could probably be jumping about lots of platforms and developing my literacy and stuff like that. But actually, it's not a mass. That's not a mass thing. That's a specialised set of
You're right.
Which actually seems to me to be okay, in the sense that actually, in the age of mass media, if you wanted to engage with mass media, you had to develop some specialised dispositions and aptitudes and so on, and spend time in particular ways. That was the way it was. We went through this kind of illusory bubble for 10 years and thinking that might be different, but it's not. And the other, so that's one thing: Snowden, skills, engagement. I also want to ask you what you think about Kim.com and Beppe Grillo, and because that actually takes that conversation about the everyday back into the Politico domain. So what does this mean for everyday? But there's still this politics of stuff that's going on that's real. People are getting elected. The mayor of Seoul, we talked about yesterday. The mayor of Seoul becoming, So there's a kind of this problem of the everyday, but then there's also this political, interesting, progressive stuff that's going on, I think.
That's a lot of things.
I've been thinking about it for a year and not thinking very clearly.
I mean, in that moment of optimism, as I think I showed, that it was still very much the case that I think organisations and individuals interested in promoting digital media literacy understood that there was a job to do to assist, enable, guide a whole range of segments of the population to participate through creative production, and that hasn't changed. But I think the agenda also has to include these kind of material critical literacies as well. And I guess another thing that's happened actually in digital media research over the last 10 years is much more understanding of the strategies and tactics that people do use in their everyday lives, even if they aren't particularly interested or skilled or adept in technology. So strategies and tactics of just avoiding being surveilled, or connecting and using two phones, whatever it might be. So I think that's something possibly that we can consider. We can consider listening and learning from the strategies and tactics that ordinary people are already doing without fetishizing the means, as it were. I hope that addresses one of the 7 things.
The lady here, you had a question?
I was interested in the kind of third strand of things that you were talking about, the being a citizen of digital media and the politics of platforms. And I'd be interested to hear your take on how people's engagement with those issues has changed kind of since pre-Web 2.0 to now, with this massive centralisation and the effect that you talk about of the Facebook phone, where suddenly the internet is Facebook, and just kind of a sense of whether you have a sense of what people's awareness is of the politics of platforms. And
I think the Facebook newsfeed is a good example of that. People are becoming very aware, and through quite playful means, through memes going around. One meme being stop liking things on Facebook for a week and see what happens, or just like everything on Facebook for a week and see what happens. And I love that because it's an experiment and people are sharing the results of that. So I think there is cause for optimism in that sense. But I don't know that most people are as concerned with, for example, what's going on with net neutrality in the States, or those big governance questions, or the big kind of competition between these mega media players. I don't know if people are as concerned at that level as they are at the level of...
And do you, sorry, because I'm sitting in the middle of a row, I can now ask a follow-up question, because they can't snatch the mic off me. Do you feel that these kind of tactics of playful and silly citizenship are powerful enough to help people to understand how they might start to engage? Does it give people a kind of channel to engage with those bigger, higher level kind of power structures, infrastructures and issues?
Well, I would always be the person arguing that it does.
Yeah. Okay.
I am an optimist.
There was a question in the back, gentleman over there. Yes?
John Hartley's had his hand up for ages, but
Yes. Come.
Should we give him a turn? Should we give him a turn?
Yeah. Hello. My question is about something I was mentioned earlier before, in relation to the last slide, which is about literacies. And I just wonder if you could give your opinion about what you think is the best strategy for nurturing those kind of literacies involved with creative citizenship. Is it in school, or is it in those communities of practice that you mentioned earlier?
Thank you. I think it's not in schools, usually. Having done the kind of digital storytelling stuff in schools and not in schools, it's not in schools. Just, yeah. I have a lot of admiration for people who do that work, but yes. I think probably the best way to nurture and build those literacies is in our own social interactions within our own social networks within those platforms, and rather than necessarily too heavy-handed or programmatic an approach. So I think peer-to-peer learning. But taking that responsibility seriously to be a good peer and not just assume that all the kids are going to do it themselves. Yeah.
Okay, Jean. One of your early slides had the big 9, and I think all of them were American corporations. And it is quite interesting that when you move from creative citizens to creative platforms, we cross the Atlantic and we start talking about corporations, and we start talking about the response to those corporations being something like critical literacy, and it's broadcast media studies all over again. So I wonder if the world in which social media are important might be studied a different way if you hang on to the idea of creative citizens. And what I'm getting at is that a critical literacy based on, speaking truth to power is all very well, but it misses out the fact that most of the internet is now in Mandarin, I would think, isn't it, or getting quite close to that? Mm-hmm. And that there's a problem of translation and difference among different users, groups, communities, countries, language groups, blah, blah, blah. Now, you're telling us that the corporations are re-territorializing and taking us down to our narrow local-ism, which is exactly what half the people here have been arguing we should be doing all weekend. So I think there's a problem of our conceptualization of what it is that we should be doing as creative citizens. And I think what I'm asking you is, to what extent do you think translation between these different areas is as important as critical literacy of the kind of known home terrain of social media?
I don't think it's an either or. I hope what I was showing with the examples of where we might want more critical awareness of how the platforms are working is precisely in how it balkanizes and parochializes our experiences, and we should be thinking about whether we want that or not, and is that okay? Absolutely. And we're going to be discussing these issues at length in our workshop on the global creative citizen later on. But yeah, massive issues. John, it's because they of that re-territorialization of market. So nobody's particularly interested in having a transnational Sina Weibo, for example, because the market for it is in China, and so that is part of the issue. What's Alibaba?
It's like an eBay, but it's much more than that.
Right.
Much more than that in China,
yeah.
and it's going global, and it will be quite important
Well, that'll be
over the next few
interesting.
years.
Yeah.
Just once more. I can speak like this, or no?
People behind you might not be able to hear you.
No, that's right. So the rebellious creative citizen. I'm from Holland, so we have this weekend masterpiece, and it's also by Facebook that people. Do you think we are able to be? You are an optimist. Can we create peace together when we are more literate and know how to use the...
I'm going to put that in the too hard basket, I think. I mean, I'm an optimist in the sense that I'm a critical pragmatist. I don't know if I'm a utopian.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Jean, for this kind of overview, and also remind us that even though there's a lot of affordance in social media, there is also a lot of constraint and sometimes hidden constraint, and I think that was quite an interesting critical view, and maybe we can also stay positive
Yeah,
in a way.
I hope
Thank
so.
you very much for this. You can all now grab a coffee in the canteen and go to the